One of my favorite types of YouTube videos or whatever type of platform you happen to use, but one of my favorite types of online videos to watch is videos that involve some sort of animal being on a senseless rampage. Now, I'm not talking about lions or bulls or something like that who are actually kind of dangerous. I'm talking about like a duck on a senseless rampage, or maybe like a goat. I find these sort of rampaging animal videos to be hilarious because it's kind of funny watching a goat who can't really hurt anybody that bad, chasing people around, they're running around cars trying to get away from them, jumping up on top of fences, whatever it is, because just seeing a ticked off goat to me is kind of funny. I also tend to really love animal noises. I don't know what it is about me, maybe it's just me as a person, but a good bleat or a good moo just makes me want to roll on the floor laughing. I remember once that my father was able to experience a camel belching in his face. And if you want to ask him about that afterwards, you can, but it was very funny. I once was on a mission trip to Sierra Leone, and just to be clear, I went on this trip and I was a full-grown man at the time, but I went on this trip, I was there to do some engineering work on a hospital, and it just so happened that all the engineers and architects, we were gathering on this particular day, and we were spending some time in prayers, we often do, but it just so happened where we were doing it, there was this goat in the yard outside of where we were praying. So, I'm supposed to be sitting there, holy, praying, meh, trying to focus, meh, trying to not laugh, but ultimately I just could not hold it together, unfortunately, and perhaps to my embarrassment. But animals, to me, are just very funny. There's a lot of funny things they do. They sound funny. They look funny, at least most of the time. Of course, there are things that animals do that are just not very funny. And there's a good chance that you can distinctly remember, as I do, maybe that time that you were told, don't touch the baby animals, because if you do, the mother will eat them. Right? I mean, to a child, and I know for me, that's kind of like a head explosion. This is a whole new paradigm of what can happen in the world. I thought spanking was bad, but mothers eating their children. This is a whole new thing. I remember that I was once told that about the classroom gerbil. Now, this whole relationship between animals and their young and how animals raise their young, this can be interesting. It can be fascinating because although there are obviously some very big differences in how animals raise their young, there are, of course, some very distinct similarities in things that animals do. And perhaps the most significant similarity in what animals do and what humans do is that there's this set period of time for animals that they are nurturing and they are just feeding into their little ones, their young. And then there's another time later on where they release them. They sort of send them out to kind of do what they are supposed to do as adult, grown-up animals. And if the timing gets messed up in any of that stuff, it can really be a real big problem on all sides. If there's not enough nurturing that happens with these animals, either because maybe the parent didn't know how to raise their young, maybe they released them or tried to release them too early, that can often lead to the death of their young. Or if the young are released too late or they're not released as they should to go be the adults that they need to be, that can create some major social conflicts amongst animals. Everything from inbreeding in those groups. It can be violent rivalry for alpha status with the parents. It's just not good or healthy when everybody tries to kind of remain together, that timing just is not right. So for the health and the well-being of these animals, they will raise their young for the period of time that they need to do that. And then when comes the appropriate moment for them to be launched, they will seek to chase them out, sometimes aggressively, so that they can go off and do what they need to do as adults. Now, of course, we should not be emulating animals, probably in most ways. In most ways, we shouldn't emulate them. But when it comes to this balance, this timing between nurturing and releasing, I think that there is something that we can actually learn from them. And it's actually something that I want us to look at more closely this morning. And this is true whether we are biological parents or maybe we're just in a relationship with someone that is sort of a parenting type relationship, particularly a mothering type of relationship with someone else, taking that kind of role in their lives. Because on one end of the spectrum, we may not nurture our children enough. And in doing so, we can damage them and we can damage our relationship with them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we can maybe nurture too much, actually smother them or damage them in the relationship in that way. And we need to find and ultimately adhere to this right balance lest we damage or destroy. So in this, I think there's a message that God has for us this morning. So I am titling this Mother's Day message, Don't Eat Your Babies. So we're going to look at this today, and we're going to be looking at this very short passage from Exodus chapter 2. So if you've not already done so, please open your Bibles so that you can follow along for the text this morning. Again, Exodus chapter 2. Now, if you remember, we went through an entire series on the book of Exodus. So we looked at this whole story. This is the story of God's deliverance of his people out of Egypt. It's the institution of the Mosaic law, which included the Ten Commandments. And this was all these rules that the nation of Israel needed to follow as they were this new nation coming into a new status of their own out of their Egyptian slavery. But Exodus 2 is before any of this stuff actually happened. This begins with the birth of Moses. So starting in verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. So the Israelites at this time were enslaved by the Egyptians, as I already mentioned. Yet despite the very harsh living conditions that they were under as slaves, there were many of them. The Hebrew children, there just were many births, and the Egyptians were actually concerned that there was going to be far too many of them, vastly exceeding their ability to control these slaves as they wanted to. So the Pharaoh at the time actually put out an order that for any Hebrew boys that were born, any Israelite boys that were born, they were to be immediately killed. So this is what the Pharaoh had said, and this is why there was a need for Moses' mother to hide him for these 3 months, because basically everybody was looking for these Hebrew boys, and if they saw them, they could very well report it, and then that child would be killed, and possibly the parents as well. Continuing in verse 3. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done with him. So Moses' mother cared for Moses as long as she could, but eventually she knew that for his own safety and perhaps even for her own safety, she was going to have to do something different. And all she could do was this rather desperate move of putting this baby in a basket, almost like, leaving a baby outside of an orphanage. This is kind of the move that she was making here. Continuing in verse 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So this daughter of Pharaoh was filled with compassion for Moses. So everything so far was kind of working, at least somewhat, as I'm sure Moses' mother had hoped. Continuing in verse 7. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Remember, of course, in this time, you couldn't just go buy baby formula at the supermarket or something. I mean, this was a young child. It needed to be nursed in some way so that it would stay alive. So Moses' sister offered the solution that Pharaoh's daughter needed. Verse 9. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, this was obviously not an ideal arrangement. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but Moses was going to be nursed by his own mother, at least until he was weaned. So there were several years here that Moses would actually be with his birth mother. And then after that, even though he wouldn't be with his mother any longer, he would have the benefits of growing up under the protection of this Egyptian adopted mother of his. And he'd be able to do that with all the privileges and benefits of kind of being under Egyptian protection as opposed to being a slave like all of the others who were Hebrew like him. But even though Moses is really the focal point, what this story is all about, anyone doing anything in this story was a woman caring for Moses in some way. And even if you go back and look in chapter 1 of Exodus, the midwives, those who were older and more experienced as women, they were protecting Moses as well in their motherly way by a refusal to kill him, as well as any of the other Hebrew boys who were born under their watch. So each of them in turn, Moses' birth mother, this Egyptian adopted mother, the midwives, and even Moses' sister served to nurture and protect Moses. But there's something that we kind of tend to forget or maybe look over when we are reading this passage, which really was just as difficult as caring for Moses. And that is that each of these individuals who was nurturing him also had to release Moses at some point to the trust and care of someone else and ultimately the trust and care of God. I mean, if you think about Moses' mother, when she put him in that basket, she didn't know what was going to really happen. Would he be safe? Would this even work? But she had to let him go. And then again, after Moses was weaned, she had to release him back to Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, this bond was there, of course, when Moses was first born, but now think 2 or 3 years or more into the future of being with Moses and teaching him in those very young years, and now she had to release him again. Pharaoh's daughter, in turn, she could have, when she first drew Moses out of the water, she could have found an Egyptian to care for him, or maybe just even tried to just sort of keep him for herself. But she chose to release Moses back to his mother because she knew that was going to be what is best for him. And of course, both of them ultimately had to let Moses go when Moses fled from Egypt as a young man after he killed an Egyptian. How do you think that these two women, these mothers of Moses, felt? What did they even think about Moses when he fled from Egypt? They probably didn't think of him as a hero in that moment. More likely, they thought of him maybe as a murderer, perhaps even a traitor. They probably had feelings of disappointment about his life trajectory, or frustrated with him, and hurt because his decision, his choices, his lack of control ultimately meant that he abandoned them. And it doesn't actually even end there, because imperfect children become imperfect parents. And imperfect adults are imperfect in their parenting. Moses was not the man that God had called him to be. Even when we get to Exodus chapter 4, when Moses had finally agreed to heed God's call to return to Egypt, he still wasn't who God wanted him to be. He was still walking in disobedience as a father and as a husband. And we learned that Moses, even on this journey back to Egypt, God was about to kill him because he had not circumcised his sons as God had required him to do in accordance with the law. And it wasn't until his wife stepped in, Zipporah, circumcised her sons for herself, that Moses' life was saved from the wrath of God. Sometimes the sacrifices a mother has to make for her children even involve carrying the responsibilities that their husband, the father, should be carrying. And some of you listening today may very well be in that same boat. You may be carrying a responsibility for your children that your husband, their father, should be carrying. If you are a mother, you have probably felt disappointment, loneliness, anger, and abandonment. You've probably felt unsupported and frustrated despite the sacrifices you have made for your children. What are you to do with those sorts of feelings of pain and difficulty? And how can you maintain a relationship or even hope to improve a relationship with a child if you feel like you're continuing to be dismissed or even beaten up as a mother and as a parent? So there's a few things that I'd like us to look at in this morning. And the first is to just simply acknowledge that there is this natural order of things, a time of nurture and a time of release for our children. There's a time for each of those things. And if we don't follow, if we don't do what we need to do, if we don't nurture when we need to nurture, if we don't release when we need to release, that can be very bad, damaging for our children, and it can be damaging for us as well. In that famous passage from Ecclesiastes 3, King Solomon, in his wisdom, said, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." And then he goes on in that chapter to list all sorts of different things. But just in the next couple verses, in verses 2 and 3, he says a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. And the passage goes on with many more things beyond that. But what is clear from this list is that these things are generally opposite sides of the same coin. Each is done in turn, and none of them can really be done simultaneously. And this same thing is true of nurturing and of releasing our children. There is a time to nurture and a time to release our children. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we can't revisit nurturing, that there might not be a time in the future to revisit nurturing. This doesn't mean that there might not be multiple times of releasing our children in different ways. But though nurturing is, of course, necessary for independence of our children one day, the independence of a child from his or her parents is necessary for that to actually happen. It's necessary for release to happen, for that independence to actually work. Each thing must be done in its appropriate time and its appropriate way. But just as important as noting that there is this time that we are to nurture and this time that we are to release, and we have to do those things appropriately, this timing must be done in a way that is best for our children, not what is best for us. If we make the determination of when to nurture or when to release based on what we think is in our own best interests or in our own timing of what we happen to like, our own preferences, we are actually likely to damage or destroy our children. And we may end up figuratively eating our babies in this process. What would have happened, if you think about it, what would have happened if Moses' mother had been unwilling to initially release Moses to the river or release him back to Pharaoh's daughter because she just couldn't let him out of her sight? What would have happened if Pharaoh's daughter had not been willing to release Moses to be nursed? She found him, so she just wanted to keep him. A failure to release in these cases would have likely resulted in Moses' death. Or what if, on the other hand, Moses had sort of been cut loose by his mother as a baby, or even as a young man? His Egyptian mother just kind of let him loose. He was given independence too early. Again, he would have quite likely died. I hear stories, and granted my children are younger, but I hear stories of parents who want to, out of love, give their children a tremendous amount of independence, to release them to choose their own way. From career to education to finances to a spouse. And intentionally, they will actually offer very little guidance in any of these areas. But invariably, what happens with little to no guidance is the child makes some very bad choices, sometimes choices that haunt them for the rest of their lives. We aren't inhibiting our children. We're not inhibiting them when we tell them that they should seek to work in a career that they enjoy, but they need to work in a career that they can actually support themselves and their family. We aren't inhibiting our children when we tell them that they need to date someone and ultimately marry someone who is part of the same faith, and to look for characteristics in a faithful and responsible spouse. And those of you who maybe have married less ideally, or in some cases very poorly, you can speak volumes into this advice. Too much independence too soon is just not good for our children. They need more nurturing sometimes. On the other side, I hear stories sometimes of parents who maybe want to keep their children home from school when they're young, all the time, not because the child is sick, but because the parent is lonely. I hear stories of parents who don't want to be empty nesters, so they create financial incentives to keep their kids in the nest much longer than they should be there, or is healthy for them. And I don't deny the love that these parents have for their children. But how they are loving them is damaging them, such as that these children may have difficulty ever learning to fly on their own. I also hear stories of very controlling parents who maybe in their wisdom know what is definitively the better way. They may know. But they insist on guiding their children when that advice is not wanted. Or they insist on doing things that their children have expressly said they don't want them to do. And their actions have actually damaged the relationship with their kids. Because sometimes children need freedom to make the mistakes in life as well. And again, I don't deny the love that parents like this have for their children. Of course they love them. They want to protect them. They want to keep them from making mistakes. But not enough independence, a failure to release, is also not good for our kids. Now, as a child gets older, they're naturally going to want more independence, of course. And sometimes they're going to want more independence than perhaps a responsible parent should give them. But at other times, they should be given independence when they don't want it for their benefit. Again, there is this time to nurture and a time to release. And it must be based on what is best ultimately for the child. Because if we don't follow through as parents in this, it can ultimately damage them and it can damage our relationship with them. And we can end up eating our own babies just from a failure to respond well. But doing this, of course, is going to take wisdom. It's going to take self-discipline from parents. But sometimes a breakdown in a relationship between a parent and a child isn't about poor timing when it comes to nurturing versus releasing. Sometimes children, even adult children, can just be nasty to their parents. They can be nasty at times. I'm sure I've been nasty at times to my parents. And particularly, sometimes children can be nasty to their mothers. And maybe you're here this morning and you as a mother, you feel like you've been beaten up and abused by your children. And maybe continue to feel that way in some capacity. Now, sometimes this is just an outpouring of the child's feelings that they maybe can't process well. And again, this could be an adult child, this could be a younger child, but maybe their own feelings of inadequacy or anger or self-loathing are just being projected onto their parents. Or sometimes this sort of reaction can be as a result of a parent's current or even their past behaviors. Maybe sinful behaviors, but maybe just something that the child didn't prefer. And perhaps the relationship you have today with your children is damaged. Maybe you don't even talk to them as a result of these things. Now, I already mentioned my kids are very young. We're not anywhere close to this sort of stage in life where this sort of independence exists. So I can't give wisdom today out of my own experience in this area. But I do wish to offer some wisdom, biblical wisdom, from another angle this morning if this is where you find yourself today, or if you know somebody who is in this spot today. Now, most of us are familiar with spiritual gift tests. If you're not familiar with the spiritual gift test, they tend to be pretty popular in Christian circles. Basically, the idea is you take a bunch of, you answer a bunch of questions, and through answering these questions, you will get some answers from the test that tell you as a Christian how you have been specifically gifted by God, empowered by the Holy Spirit in a very specific way. And I'm not against these tests or anything, but each test, if you take it, does get built a little bit differently. And often, depending on your theological persuasion or maybe the person who built the test, these the potential results, whatever it's going to say your spiritual gift is, they will change in some ways. Maybe it's a longer list, maybe it's a shorter list, in many ways based on the theological persuasion of the person who wrote the test. So when you take a test, if you've taken a test, even though one test to another, you might find that there are many similarities. Maybe the same types of gifts or the same major primary gift shows up for you each time you take it. But it's not uncommon that as you take different tests throughout your life, well, maybe there's some other gift that shows up that maybe you've never thought of before. I mean, for example, for me, whenever I take these tests, teaching always comes off as one of the highest gifts for me. It tends to be a primary gift that is indicated. But once I took a test that said that one of my major gifts was apostleship. Never thought of that before. Never considered anything like that. Another time I took a test, it said that one of my highest ranking spiritual gifts was the gift of martyrdom. Which, at the time I was about to go on a mission trip. This was a different mission trip. And that makes you think twice when you're about to leave the country and go do this thing. Oh, guess what? This is your spiritual gift. Now, that may be sort of funny, but I actually think that test result was accurate for me, even though you don't usually see that as even being a potential option on most of these tests. I do believe I actually have a spiritual gift of martyrdom. But I want to be very clear in this, that the spiritual gift of martyrdom is different from having a martyr complex, right? Very different things. Where a martyr complex is when an individual is very focused on themselves. Someone with a martyr complex may work really hard. They may do lots of things, but the focus in doing those things is always kind of pointed back at themselves. Look at how much I'm suffering. Look at what I'm doing. Look, it's kind of a me kind of thing. And somebody who's got a martyr complex, when they don't get noticed for the ways that they are suffering, they can get very frustrated. Sometimes they'll even stop doing those things because, again, the reason for sort of this self-inflicted pain is not about the sacrifice, it's about the recognition. This is very different from somebody who has a gift of martyrdom. Because the gift of martyrdom is very much from the angle that a person is going to give everything that they have, even if that includes their own life, regardless of whether or not somebody is watching, regardless of whether or not somebody even notices. And there's little need in this gift for any form of recognition at all, even in the most extreme of sacrifices. And if nobody notices, that's okay. It has little impact on the continued desire to sacrifice. And the reason I see this gift as being in me is for two reasons. One, because I usually I don't feel a need for personal recognition for sacrifices that I may happen to make. Now, I do share more here as a pastor, but I do that only because I think that there is a benefit to modeling behavior. But if I wasn't a pastor, if I wasn't up here, if there was no need to model behavior, you'd probably hear even less from me about sacrifices that I've happened to make over time. But two, the reason why I think that I have this gift is because I regularly will think through hypothetical situations, knowing that if they ever happened, I would probably die. Which maybe is weird. I mean, for me, it just seems like a normal thing to do. And I don't think this way because, somebody I love might be involved in the situation or whatever it is. But it really just is because that is how I feel that I'd be compelled to respond, and whatever the circumstance is. And maybe if you think this way, and that's kind of a regular way that kind of things run through your head, well, maybe you have a gift of martyrdom as well. I watch Star Trek sometimes, and in Star Trek, there's the character Worf. And Worf, as one of the Klingons, has this saying, and I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but before going into battle, they would say, "Today is a good day to die. Today is a good day to die." That kind of intentional mental predisposition towards preparing to give it all, everything in the face of extreme danger, that resonates with me just very naturally with my soul. So the wisdom that I want to offer this morning is from somebody who operates in this gift of martyrdom. When we are being hurt by our children, either by what they do or what they fail to do, our natural tendencies as humans is to protect ourselves and retaliate. That's what we're going to do, even if we love someone. Retaliate with words, retaliate with things that we do, or feel even in response to our children. And we will often do these things knowing that they are going to damage the relationship and they're going to damage the other person. What I, as someone who has the gift of martyrdom, wants to tell you this morning is that sometimes, in order to do what is going to be best for our children in the long run, sometimes we just have to suck it up. We have to be the bigger men and bigger women. Does it hurt? Yes. Does it push our buttons or prick our pride? Absolutely. Is it uncomfortable and anxiety-provoking? Yes. Will we experience loss? Probably. But if we, as parents, with our years and years of experience, if we are not going to be the mature ones, then nobody may be the mature one in the relationship to the ultimate detriment of that relationship, even to its possible demise. Now, please hear me when I'm saying this. I'm not saying we should just let ourselves be abused. I'm not saying we should let ourselves be mistreated. I'm not saying we can't have standards or boundaries, because we should. But what I'm saying here is that if the situation arises when we can either take the road of long-term offense and choose to have little or no relationship with our children at all, if that's one choice, or we can choose to keep the door open, be ready to forgive and re-engage, even if it hurts, we may be the only ones in the relationship with the maturity to be able to make that sacrifice, to be the martyr in the relationship. Just like there's more than one way to skin a cat, there's more than one way to eat your babies as well, if you think about it. We can do that by failing to nurture them. We can do that by failing to release them. But we can also eat our babies in self-defense. Don't eat your babies. Don't eat your babies. To be willing to take on the pain, the suffering, the loneliness, the abuse, to be willing to walk through all of that and still be willing to forgive and re-engage as a parent is a form of martyrdom. It is. And if you think about it, this is the form of martyrdom that Jesus himself took on for us. 1 Corinthians 15 says this, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures." Jesus died for the sins of us who didn't deserve his death. We all sin. We all turn away from God. We've all been offensive to Jesus. We've been idolatrous at times. We love our money more. We love our security more. We love our families more. We love our pride and even ourselves more than we love him, many times. We spend our time on our own pleasure. We ignore God. This is hurtful and offensive behavior, especially to the one who created us. Kind of like how kids can sometimes be really offensive and hurtful to us as parents. Yet whenever we turn to God, even if God knows that tomorrow we're going to turn our backs on him again, he's there with open arms, ready to receive us every time. Not as a pushover. God's not a pushover. Not as one who can be taken advantage of. You can't take advantage of God. Not as one who has no standards. Of course God has standards. But as one who, despite having all of those things, is still willing to forgive and love his prodigal children. Maybe you're one of God's prodigals. Maybe you're here as a sort of a prodigal child here today. Maybe you feel like you've gone too far, that there's no return back to God. But that's not true. God in his mercy and love is ready to forgive and receive you today and tomorrow and the next day, regardless of what you do or what you have done, if you will just turn to him and follow him. This is the power of the love and mercy of the God we follow. As a mother, as a parent, God sees your sacrifice and your pain as a martyr. He sees it whether your children are successes or failures. He sees it even if nobody else sees it, nobody else is willing to acknowledge it. And he's right there with you in your pain and in your suffering. even if it's a relationship with your children that will not be mended on this side of eternity. So my encouragement to you this morning, because I want to be encouraging, especially if you are a mother or in a mothering relationship in some way, and you're experiencing this struggle, this pain, this difficulty with your children, maybe you're at your breaking point. Maybe you're about to say, I'm done. It's over. I'm just going to move on with life. My encouragement to you, not in a finger-wagging kind of way, but it's just to remind you, don't eat your children. Don't eat your babies. Keep on going. Keep going as your Father in heaven keeps on going for you. Look around you. This morning, here, there's lots of mothers here. Turn to someone you know is a mother right now and tell them, don't eat your babies. This is the interactive part. Don't eat your babies. If you know a mother who is struggling in life, maybe who's not here this morning, support her, help her, rally behind her. Encourage her to not sabotage her life and her relationships with her children by reminding her not to eat her babies. Maybe you'll get a laugh out of her. She probably won't know what you're talking about. When a month from now, you come across a mother who's at her wit's end, ready to explode on her children. Things are so challenging in her house. Or maybe she's attempted to enable them when she shouldn't, or not release them in some way when she should. Take her hand and tell her, don't eat your babies. When you're telling each other Happy Mother's Day today, out to lunch, whatever you're doing, add it in there, and don't eat your babies. We only have a few years with our children. And we need to support each other in this very important nurturing task. So use this as a phrase to encourage each other. To remind each other that you identify with the challenge that the mothers among us are going through and facing. That even when it gets tough, stay strong. Don't eat your babies. We have to do what is best for them as Jesus continues to do what is best for us. Let's pray.